right, this is the next in our series, Coping with COVID. Today's subject is one that I think everybody is pretty painfully aware of, is this idea about fighting versus uniting. You know, when we first saw this virus coming a long way off, and I first heard the news from China, and boy, you know, I knew something was coming and this was going to be really, really tough on us. The thing I really kind of let myself hope was that this would be that external threat that would really help us to unite, because in case you hadn't noticed it, we've had a hard time doing that over the last couple of decades. America has become progressively more and more polarized in our perspective on socio-political issues, but on just about everything. And that is probably the worst thing we could possibly experience in our country. The concept that says, "A house united against itself cannot stand," is a quote that comes from Jesus Christ, as well as Abraham Lincoln, and it could not be more valid words. This is the most threatening issue there is in America, is our inability to unite and work together on any issue. Well, as we have seen, the worst fears would come to pass, which is that it has been a tremendously dividing experience for us. People are divided in camps, and that's what's made us so ineffective in dealing with this threat. That in fact we've done all kinds of things, but we're constantly working at odds with each other, and therefore we haven't gotten good resolution, and we've done tremendous damage to our country in the process, and yet we're still in a really tough spot. So I was encouraged at the beginning of all this when people were saying things like, well, maybe this is really something that is meant to teach us a lesson, and there was allusions made that this had some divine involvement, which I'm kind of inclined to believe it does, or some other people believe that it was something that was created by China to bring us down, and I'm not so inclined to believe that, but certainly you can make an argument for that one as well. But one way or another is a kind of test for us, and I'm afraid that we haven't done so well with it. So relatively early on in this whole process, I had a couple of really interesting situations in therapy, and one of them was a married couple, both of whom had come home to quarantine, and they were able to work video from home, and both took this reasonably seriously, but the husband used his free time then to do work in the shop, you know, at his garage and working on projects and so on. And he just kind of matter-of-factly, each time that he needed something, he'd jump in his truck and go over to Home Depot and get some wood or some other tools or whatever. And after coming home, probably after the 5th or 6th time during 1 week of doing that, his wife met him red-faced at the door and said, "If you do that again, I'm having the locks changed before you get home." And that was kind of shocking to him, and it kind of made the point that said, okay, I'm probably not taking this quite as seriously as I should. And maybe she was a little bit overreacting in that. And so they've had to really kind of work at it and find a better balance in that. But it was a really good illustration of a guy who was perfectly kind of innocently and well-intentioned, but really kind of missing the mark on how to find balance in that. On the other hand, his wife probably was a little bit extreme in her reaction, so we're looking for kind of more of a balance in that whole situation. Then I thought I had it all figured out, was kind of warmed and amused by that. But then on a Sunday morning in March or April, when Steve Johnson had me to his morning news show on Sunday morning on Channel 19, and we were talking about coping with COVID and these exact kind of issues, I then thought, well, I'd be very efficient, and I would run by the grocery on the way home and put on my mask and gloves and go in there and buy the things we needed early on Sunday morning, which is a low crowd time, so it seemed like a great idea to me. Came home, and when I got in the door and I put my groceries down on the counter, my wife just flushed red and was really, really angry. You know, one, that I was putting them on the counter instead of on the floor, and also that, you know, the place that I'd gone, she thought was sort of a questionable place, and it created a lot of tension between the two of us. And we had to kind of sort that one out and realize that, in fact, probably her reaction was a little much, and, you know, that I needed to really, you know, show some real caution in each step of this process I do. So in each of these cases, we're looking at the way that well-intentioned people can often just see things differently, and we see how, in this case, we're talking about a male-female split on this. Some other kind of examples I've seen over the course of this time are, I was in the gym the other day, and an older fellow was talking about his son who is who wasn't wearing a mask, and he said, well, he should know better. He's a paramedic and he's a SWAT guy. And I thought, well, he's a SWAT guy. You know, it's like, this guy's not going to be intimidated by some old germs. And in fact, I'm glad that those guys are intimidated by things, because they have to charge into really threatening situations to protect us. So there is a personality factor here that is in terms of how does he perceive this. On the other hand, what we see right now is we also have teachers who are really fearful of going back into the classroom, subjecting themselves to the illness or risking children in the illness. But we look at who they are. They are nurturers. In the case of threat, they'll do the opposite of the SWAT guy. They will withdraw and they will protect. And so this is very, very unnatural for them. So in these cases, we're seeing the way that we just see these situations very differently. So none of this is meant to be disparaging of anybody, but it's to make the point that says what we're seeing here is a version of what we've seen in America for the last quarter century, which is damaging us so badly. We have built-in perspective bias. We just see things differently. At an earlier time in our history and many other communities' histories, they're able to find that middle ground and find at least compromise, if not genuinely a consensus and synergy solution that is the best of all things. But right now, we just aren't doing that. Some of the question gets into why. We referenced that point earlier of saying, maybe this is a test. Maybe this is something that's given to us divinely. You don't have to believe that. You can believe it's just a weird thing that happens. You can believe that the Chinese created it. It's not really important to me. I tend to believe it has purpose for us as a society, as individuals. But it's such a well-designed test. I want you to really look at this. If we had a disease which was just horribly damaging to everybody who got it, and you got symptoms really clearly, and you knew when people could communicate the illness, boy, everybody would be on board with that. Or if you had a disease which was not such a big deal, kind of like everybody gets a cold, anybody, regardless of their socio-political orientation, would be fine with just not worrying about that. What we got is this really incredibly designed challenge, which we have not risen to so well, which is, on one hand, if you look at it in a certain way, it looks very threatening. You can look at things like, for instance, that we know for sure that in the elderly, and particularly people with organ problems, their chances of having severe complications and dying of this is like 8 or 9 times greater than the flu. For young people, especially children, evidently the chances are like 8 or 9 times less likely to die from it or have complications as the flu. Now, of course, what we're seeing also in that whole complicating picture is that some of that stuff which was absolutist at the beginning is not even so absolutist anymore. Seeing much more kids showing up in hospitals and having much more serious pictures, as well as some long-standing organ damage sequelae. So it makes the point that on one hand this is a very complex thing, but it sends 2 very dramatically different messages. So I got to think about, what is this doing? This is such an ideal design to really get us to think in terms of how we can flip from one perspective to the other. So the other point I want to make is that issue of, you can be contagious with this without showing symptoms, which is different. If you had Ebola here, easy to figure that one out. By the time you can be transmitting that disease to other people with Ebola, basically you're in bed dying. However, with this thing, you can communicate it and not look sick at all. That makes it much more mysterious and invisible and treacherous all at the same time. So I want you to look at this picture that's probably a lot of you all have already seen, which is the one of the beautiful young woman in the hag. And this is one of those things where you look at it one way, you can see the old woman's profile and the big nose and then the kind of crease in her mouth and so on. And then you look at it again, you see it's a young woman with her face turned away from you, a lovely young woman. And we can see 2 different things in that. And people will naturally see one more than the other. That's because this stuff is on a perception level. It's not even on so much of an attitude or way of thinking level. It is literally how we see things. And I felt like this is one of the best ways to make the point as to what we have going on here, is that by personality, we see things fundamentally differently. And then we attach to that because it looks like that truth. And therefore, when people oppose us, we just push harder in on our truth rather than recognizing that, in fact, our truth may be an incomplete one. So whether this applies to your home, conflict with your spouse, conflict with your job or your school, or within our whole country, this disease is a test, and we're not doing real well with it. The test is, can we get it? That life is complex, perception needs to be complex, and solutions need to be complex. We're going to follow up on this further and talk more about what I believe to be the greatest threat to America's future is our fundamental divisiveness. It is greater than it has ever been in our history. It is caricature-like, and it is horrifying. It is doing great damage to us. And choosing a side and fighting harder on that side is not the solution. You become more the problem than the solution. So we're going to follow up on this with some much more specific things and hopefully some interesting things like this picture I showed you that really, in this case, become much more data specific, some very factual things about what's happening to us, and hopefully some ideas about what we can do as individuals, families, and a country to dig out of this. So thank you so much for listening. Please leave your comments below. This is meant to be a collaborative consortium. So I don't mean for this to be a conflict, fighting with each other, that kind of thing. We would just continue the same thing we're already doing. This is meant to be a reasonable discussion of ideas. And so I want to move forward with that. I invite you to share comments as well as invite us to talk about certain things. And by all means, make sure to sanitize and subscribe. And thank you for watching.